Today we speak with Egyptologist Dr. Anthony Browder about the black origins of ancient Egypt, as well as his ASA Restoration Project, a project which has been in existence for 9 years. Dr. Browder, for several centuries, for I would say maybe 100 years in particular, ancient Egypt has been the subject of much debate regarding the racial origin of the Egyptians. What is the big deal, or shall I say, why do most individuals have a hard time? What is it about Egypt that causes most individuals to have a hard time believing that it was originally a black civilization?
Sure. Well, the reality of the situation is that ancient Egypt, or Kemet, is the world's oldest documented civilization. And Kemet was established by indigenous African people from the south, from Upper Kemet, which is in the southern portion of the country, and founded by an African ruler. And then there were periods where invaders came in throughout the 30 dynastic period of ancient Kemet, roughly 3,000 years. And in every instance where invaders came in from the north, primarily Asiatics, and then later Greeks, and then later still Romans, in every instance when invaders come in, every force that repelled the invaders came in from the south. So Kemetic civilization is a civilization that began up south in near the origins of the Nile River, coming out of the Blue Nile in Ethiopia, the White Nile coming out of Uganda. So the culture migrated northward down the Nile, and the two Nile rivers join in Khartoum and form the singular Nile Valley, which continues to flow through Sudan and through Egypt and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. So every time there were invasions from the north, the rulers who were defeated retreated to the south, marshaled their forces, and then drove out the foreign invaders. So these were always African people. After Kemet fell, and Europeans began to come into Kemet primarily during the time of Napoleon's invasion of Kemet. Napoleon was there from 1790, I think it was 1798 to 1801. And it was Napoleon who brought with him scholars, scientists, artists, and literally jump-started the science of Egyptology. And so when white folk began to look at the history, the culture, the architecture, the engineering that had been developed in ancient Kemet, they could not accept the reality that this ancient civilization had been initiated and maintained by African people, the very people who in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century were being enslaved. So as part of the justification for slavery, they had to deny the African origins of an African country. And so it's madness when you really look at it, that one would put forth the idea, the theory, the lie, that the founders of an African civilization were not African at a time when civilization did not exist anywhere else in the world. So the essence of your question is centered around denying African people their proper place in history so that we can continue to be despised by the people who enslaved us, lynched us, and still hate us simply because of the color of our skin.
Now, in the 1950s, Professor George G.M. James had wrote the book Stolen Legacy. Right. And in it, he asserts that Greek philosophy is actually stolen African or Egyptian philosophy.
Right.
Since that time, has any more proof come about that would further confirm that or support that notion?
Oh, of course. And it's not just philosophy, it's science, it's architecture, it's engineering. So George G.M. James wrote Stolen Legacy around 1954, I believe, and was murdered shortly after that book was written. And it has been asserted by Dr. Ben primarily, who said that Professor James was murdered by Masons for revealing Masonic information. And also, if you think about the fact that Professor James was teaching at the university, which is now the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff, 1954, You had Brown versus Board of Education. Around the same time, you have the desegregation of school systems. So the last thing in the world that white folk wanted, the last thing in the world that racists wanted, is some scholar, right, to come out and say that the Greek civilization, which Europeans hold in high regard, was actually built upon a foundation that began in Africa thousands of years earlier. So Professor James's book disappeared shortly after his murder and did not resurface until 1976, when Dr. Asa Hilliard, who was at San Francisco State, gave a copy that he had to a colleague of his, who then reprinted it and then put that book back in circulation. So back in the 1970s, Sheikh Anta at the Cairo Symposium, 1974, had done similar studies to show the African origins of an African culture and civilization. He also created the melanin dosage test, where he as a chemist was able to illuminate the skin of royal mummies in the Cairo Museum, count the melanocytes in their skin, and showed that scientifically this skin, the melanocytes in his skin, in the skin of these royal mummies, can only be found in the skins of people who were classified as African people to this very day. And then one of the latest updates, if you will, of George G. James' Stolen Legacy publication is a book written by Dr. Teofilo Benga, who was a colleague of Sheikh Anta Diop. And that book is entitled African Philosophy, the Pharaonic Period. And what he's done is to literally take some of the same concepts and ideas of Kemetic origins of philosophy, science, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, and he took the actual Kemetic text, the Medu Neter text, which he then translated and then transliterated so that there was no doubt whatsoever as to the African origins of the very same things that Professor George G. James was murdered for writing several decades earlier.
So what we want to know, you've lectured extensively, speaking of African origins, you've lectured extensively on the African origins of Christianity and Judaism and Islam.
Yes.
Is there further proof, if you would, that substantiates, we've heard many African-centered scholars such as yourself, Ben and Clark, say that the stories that we read in the Bible are nothing more than rehashed stories.
Exactly.
Is there further proof of this? And the reason we're asking, of course, we've seen people attempt to debunk this notion.
Of course. And I would say that people who attempt to debunk this notion are just doing that, attempting. They're not debunking it because the evidence is solid. The evidence is clear. And Napoleon was in Egypt for 3 years. Napoleon was responsible for finding an object that was called the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone was used by Champollion, the French philologist, to decipher the Medu Neter in 1822. Now, the deciphering of Medu Neter in 1822 made it possible for Europeans to read what was written on the temples and the walls and the papyri, which had been, that knowledge, the ability to read Medu Neter had been lost for 1,300 years after a Roman emperor by the name of Justinian closed the last Kemetic temple at Philae, which was the last temple in Kemet where Medu Neter had been written. His justification for closing down the temple was because he wanted to eliminate all of the evidence that proved that Christianity was built on the backbone of Kemetic philosophy and spiritual traditions. So now that Medu Neter had been translated, scholars then went back into Kemet, armed with the ability to read this language, and they found on the walls of temples at Philae, on the walls of the temple at Abydos, on the walls of the temple at Luxor, on the walls of the temple at Edfu, they found Kemetic stories that were thousands of years older than the Bible that were exactly the same story. Right? So that evidence exists, and for those people that refuse to embrace that evidence, that's on them. It doesn't deny the validity of the historical information that is there.
Now, before we go into your latest project,
Yes.
excavating sites in Kemet or Egypt, I want to ask you this question. You mentioned Napoleon.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any proof Dr. Bennett said that, you know, we talk about the hiding the African or the black origin of Kemet or Egypt.
Right.
I believe Dr. Bennett said that Napoleon had one of his troops aim a cannon at the nose of the what's popularly referred to as the Sphinx, because he wanted to destroy its black image. Now, Doc, is that true or is that an urban legend?
All right. Well, in my book, Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, I addressed that issue, and I think I answered it pretty conclusively in that I had compiled a series of drawings, illustrations of Hera-Maket, the so-called Sphinx, drawings that were done in the 16th century, the 17th century, and the 19th century when Napoleon was there. So when you look at those drawings, and it's in the book, when you look at the drawings, you'll see that in the earlier drawings, 150, 200 years before Napoleon came, you could still see the nose and the lips of Hera-Maket. There were efforts on the part of other Arabs to damage the face of Hera-Maket because to them, they considered to be a false idol.
And this is before the European incursion.
Exactly.
You said the Arabs were already trying to destroy the black images.
Right. Well, they not only destroyed some of the images, they stripped all of the limestone off of the pyramids of Giza, used that limestone to build bridges in Cairo, mosques in Cairo. So this is something that invaders have done traditionally since the beginning of time. But in Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, I show that the greatest damage done to the face of Hera-Maket was done during the 3 years that Napoleon's troops were in Egypt. And according to the story, Napoleon had his soldiers shoot off the nose and the lips of Hera-Maket because he could not accept the fact that this civilization, the oldest documented civilization known to mankind, was created by African people, and the face of Hera-Maket was the documentation for that. What is also important, I found evidence to show that when Napoleon's troops had invaded other countries, for example, when they invaded Italy, there is a documented case where they invaded the monastery at Maria de Grazia in Italy. And there is a famous painting in the dining hall of that monastery. It's a painting that was done by Leonardo da Vinci, the painting that we now know as the Last Supper. Napoleon conquered that region of Italy. They used the dining hall as a stable for their horses, and then their soldiers took their rifles and shot the faces of Jesus and the 12 disciples. So there is, Napoleon's troops have a track record of defacing historical objects. So it wasn't just Hera-Maket. So
now tell me, now the image, the Last Supper image, it was a white image though.
Yeah.
There was a white image. So, so then, Doc, someone would say then if Napoleon's troops had damaged the white image, why would it be racist for him to damage the so-called Sphinx?
Well, let's put it this way. The issue was Napoleon wasn't a Christian, right? And the Italians were his enemies. So whatever he could do to get under the skin of his enemies, he did. Because warfare is not always a physical confrontation. Sometimes it's psychological, sometimes it's spiritual. So Napoleon is considered by many to be one of the greatest military leaders at all time. And it wasn't just because he conquered people physically, he also conquered their minds. And that is a part of the oppressing of your enemy and your prisoners of war. He was racist as well, but that's another story.
Well, Doc, we want to know from you your current project.
Sure.
What exactly is the ASA, if I'm saying it correctly, Restoration Project?
Right. The ASA Restoration Project was a project that we started 9 years ago. September of 2008, we established the ASA Restoration Project.
So it's not a latest project, it's actually an old project. I shouldn't have said that, sorry.
Well, no, it's been around for a while, but it's still relatively new in terms of other excavations that are going on in Egypt. I was fortunate in 2008 to be introduced to a woman by the name of Dr. Lena Pistakova, who in 2006 had found the lost tombs of South Ossetia. These were tombs of Kushite noble people and the Kushites were part of the 25th dynasty. The 25th dynasty is the only period in the 30 dynasties of Egyptian history that white Egyptologists will say with certainty that Egypt or Kemet was ruled by indigenous black people.
Now, I remember, if I may interject, Doctor,
sure,
that when National Geographic did that story a few years back, it had a lot of black scholars, Afrocentered black scholars, in an uproar because they were trying to say that that was the only time
exactly
Kemet had been ruled by black rulers.
Exactly. And so it perpetuates this lie, this effort on the part of European scholars primarily to deny Africans their rightful place in world history. As Dr. Leonard Jeffries said decades ago, whoever controls the history of Kemet controls the world. Because it is in Kemet where we find the greatest evidence of human accomplishments. What was done in Kemet 5,000 years ago cannot be replicated today in terms of the architecture and the engineering, the science and the astronomy. So why on earth would white people acknowledge that Africans had these skills when the Europeans themselves, i.e. the Greeks and the Romans, didn't possess those skills? So they lie to cover it up, and they have to perpetuate that lie in order to maintain their false sense of superiority. But so the 25th dynasty were Africans from Kush who came in around 750 BC to restore the land of their ancestors. Those were their words. Kemet had been conquered by Assyrians who had placed puppet rulers in positions of leadership in Kemet. And so it was an African king by the name of Kashta who initiated the first effort on the part of these Kushite noble people and kings to come in and rescue the land of their ancestors. They ultimately did and established the 25th dynasty. And so the first 25th dynasty tombs that were built on the west bank of Luxor near the Valley of the Kings were built for two Kushite noble people. The first was Karabashkin, who was the mayor of Waset. Waset is the city that we now know as Luxor. Luxor and Karnak, which are double cities, was at that time, from the 18th dynasty on, was at that time the spiritual and political capital of Kemet. So what Karabashkin was responsible for was rebuilding the spiritual and political capital of Kemet after the foreigners had been driven out. The second Kushite tomb built at that site was for a man by the name of Karakamen. Karakamen was a priest at the temple of Karnak.
This concludes part one of our interview with Dr. Anthony Browder.